Throughout the year, we have witnessed cruel injustice toward African American men and women. Protests and demonstrations in Baltimore and across the country that follow these acts have been filled with frustration, trauma, and anger. Arguably, no person has been closer to observing and listening to the protests than our keynote speaker, Omar Jimenez, CNN national correspondent. 2020 has been also quite a year for Omar Jimenez. In his first year as a CNN national correspondent, he's been the lead reporter in the death of Kobe Bryant, was assigned to cover an initial COVID-19 outbreak in March, 7 months ago, at a nursing home in Kirkland, Washington, and he was at the forefront of numerous protests within the Black Lives Matter movement, including the death of George Floyd. You may even recall that he and his crew were arrested on live television in Minneapolis while covering the protests after Floyd's death. Omar started with CNN in 2017 for the network's affiliate service CNN News Source. His work at News Source included reporting from Las Vegas shortly after the mass shooting there, the deadliest in modern American history, and reporting from Florida and Texas during the 2017 hurricanes that became part of CNN's Emmy-nominated coverage. Prior to joining CNN, Jimenez worked for WBAL-TV right here in Baltimore, where he was a reporter and fill-in anchor. While at WBAL, he received an individual Emmy nomination for general assignment reporting. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome back to Baltimore, Omar Jimenez.
Thank you, Don. Well, somehow I just knew your introduction would be amazing. Absolutely nailed it. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you to you all for having me as part of the Greater Baltimore Committee's annual meeting this year. As you just heard, my name is Omar Jimenez, and I'm a national correspondent for CNN. But of course, I credit any success I've ever had and will ever have to my roots here in Baltimore at WBAL. The city grows you up really fast, as you may know. My job now doesn't so much happen in one place, it happens really everywhere. I'm not in the studio, I'm the one who's actually in the field, on the scene, usually heading toward whatever chaos is making headlines. I've been in this role for about a year now, and even by my standards, it's been a year, hasn't it? This is the part where I would usually pour a shot for myself. Now, just in the stories I covered this year, I covered Kobe Bryant's sudden death along with the death of his young daughter Gianna inside that helicopter, the beginning of a coronavirus outbreak at a nursing facility outside Seattle that eventually became a pandemic in our new way of life, and I was the first correspondent at the network to be sent to Minneapolis to cover the story of a man who died after a police encounter caught on video where the final moments are seen over the course of 8 excruciating minutes pleading for air under the knee of an unmoving police officer. It happened on Memorial Day this year, and I remember getting the call early that next morning to head up there. Because of coronavirus, there weren't many flights that would get me there in time, so I chose to do the 6-hour drive from Chicago, where I'm based. I figured there would be protests, so I packed some of my slowly dwindling N95 masks to help mitigate any risks there would have been from crowds. I had no idea what I was truly driving into. Now, this year really has been defined by 2 things: COVID-19 and the Great Fire, as Vanity Fair called it, to use their words, when Americans defied the pandemic and rallied to the streets in what would become the largest protest movement in decades. So the question is why? Why did we see this when we've had black people die at the hands of police for years, decades? Many of them high-profile cases that have led to protests, just not on this scale. So let's start with George Floyd, because that was the spark. Every day on the ground there, the cycle was basically this: peaceful protests during the day with people showing up in the hundreds, and then more violent demonstrations, even rioting and fires at night. And this happened for days in a row. The daytime demonstrations growing bigger and the nighttime ones getting a little more extreme as now a police precinct was going up in flames. At the time, days later, the officers involved had been fired but hadn't been charged with anything. And while it does take time to formally draft up charges, to the public and the protesters, the probable cause to arrest someone was sitting right there on a torturous cell phone video that at this point people in places across the world had seen. What are you waiting for? That was the central question. As more time passed, the angrier people got, fearful that the officers involved wouldn't face any real consequences. About 4 days after George Floyd was killed, the officers still haven't been arrested. Each day, the anger had seemed to grow, and we were putting in resources to make sure we had eyes on every aspect of it, the good, the bad, and of course, the ugly. This specific morning, my team and I were out in the early morning hours reporting on what at that time of the day could only be described as anarchy. No real visibly organized protests, 6-7-story buildings on fire, all outside the police precinct that had burned over the course of previous nights, and all happening without any sort of law enforcement presence whatsoever. This went on for hours until suddenly, all at once, fire trucks, police, and more arrived basically as one swift unit. Our crew started to back away, but as we turned, we saw a line of state police and National Guard advancing from blocks away, so we just went up a block and made a left to get out of their way, because that's what you would do when you see something like that. They eventually form a protective line around the very blocks we'd seen get absolutely destroyed over the course of hours in the early morning, and we were right outside the perimeter. Honestly, as far as backdrops for a live report go, this was one of the best we had, maybe ever. It told so much of the story. So we start reporting live for one of our 6 a.m. Eastern Time shows, and a woman comes running past us, like out of nowhere, basically from where the police line was. So we turn the cameras to her as she's being taken down and cuffed, rolling with the live TV we were seeing unfold right in front of us. Next thing I know, though, the police had now surrounded us. We continued to report because everything seemed calm. There were never any other words spoken between myself and the police in those moments, except for when the officer who was now holding my arm said, "You're under arrest." I was now literally being handcuffed live on television by Minnesota State Police. And while that was maybe the most shocking moment for most people, from a learning perspective, to me, it wasn't the most important. That comes from context and how it was handled next. Let's start with the latter. We were released from custody about an hour and a half later. I don't even remember if it was during or after, but Minnesota police had tweeted their account of what had happened, saying in the process of clearing streets, they arrested 3 CNN reporters, and once they were able to confirm we were members of the media, we were released. Come on. Brutal. Not only did we show our press badges and announce we were with CNN, we were also live on TV. Also, you have my ID. Google me. It's that easy. But the real reason that tweet was important is we were given the gift of indisputable documentation. Even despite that, the police put out a narrative that under any other circumstance would have been seen as the truth. It's an embodiment of the discretion they have in scenarios that aren't filmed live on international television. How many cases can you think of where the actions of the victim were questioned, especially in regards to the actions of police? Oh, he must have done this. Oh, he must have done that. And all of a sudden, we're not even working with the same set of facts here. So that's one. 2 comes down to context. My mind immediately went to the Baltimore case of Freddie Gray, who I'm sure all of you remember, especially that time. Not because I thought Freddie Gray and I were similar people or grew up the same way or even in a similar situation, but because there's one simple haunting fact that remains from that story. He got into a police van alive and then exited with injuries we later learned would lead to his death. And no one was held criminally responsible. I covered the trials for the officers charged in this, and as you may remember, all of the officers involved were eventually acquitted as the cases dropped. So what that says is from the criminal justice system's perspective, someone died and it was no one's fault. So fast forward to my situation. It was maybe laid out no better than in a text message from my mom trying to explain her fear that day. She said she didn't want to be another mother whose black son died in police custody. Because while the arrest happened on live TV, what happened after that wasn't. And so for the next hour and a half, I was in what we've seen can be a dangerous form of limbo, where I could end up totally fine, as I was, or I could end up with an unexplained injury that could have led to something much worse, where police could have gotten away with bending the truth if not for indisputable documentation, where I ended up in cuffs before the officers tied to the killing of George Floyd. There's pain and anger in that statement. When I was realizing that my experience was now a microcosm of the larger story I was trying to cover, there was no more effective way to explain why so many people were frustrated than to show you, whether it was my choice or not. The next day, something happened that still sticks with me. Now, this is the first Saturday after Floyd was killed, and was maybe the most contentious confrontations we had seen between protesters and police in Minneapolis. But the thing is, it wasn't just Minneapolis. Nearly every city you could think of had people marching in the streets, the names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and more, a central theme in the chants and the messaging. I'd never seen anything like it. Sure, I'd seen protests over city-specific incidents that might spill into other cities, but to see a unified march of solidarity in cities from coast to coast was a moment we haven't seen in a long time, if ever. Just this year, I covered protests in Minneapolis, Portland, some there more on message than others, and in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in the aftermath of Jacob Blake being shot in the back multiple times by a police officer. And those are just the ones I covered. I didn't even touch the Breonna Taylor in Kentucky or the Ahmaud Arbery and Rayshard Brooks cases in Georgia. I said this in Kenosha, but a lot of times the protests and events that spark them are viewed as moments. Oh, Minneapolis is having a moment. Oh, Kenosha is having a moment. Oh, Louisville is having a moment. Collectively, these moments were turning into a movement. What's different this year is that this felt like more than just a black community problem. It felt like an American problem. And when you look at what America's been through this year, job loss in the economy, a coronavirus pandemic that's made many of us come to grips with our own mortality, the looming shadow of a quickly approaching and contentious election. What it means to be an American has always been a high-stakes fight for black people in the country, and this year seems to be the first year in a long time that people can relate to that feeling. That sense of urgency, where when you talk to protesters, it's about more than just the issue I'm on the ground to cover. It's about the direction of this country and who we want to be as Americans. As a reporter, there's only a limited number of things I can do. I shed light on things, and then those in power act. Sometimes that's our government officials, but, well, let's be honest. Based on the pace of Congress these days, I'm not usually holding my breath. So, where does that leave us? That leaves us with you, the private sector. You play an incredibly powerful role in shaping our country. Some might argue more so at times than even our federal government. And it's all connected. A community doesn't get investment. It leads to high crime, which leads to higher policing, which leads to more uses of force, to a community member, oftentimes black, being killed, sometimes unjustifiably, which leads to people marching in the streets. I report on it, and that brings us to me talking to you. These communities have been feeling this 2020 urgency for a long time, but it gets discouraging when half of the energy is spent on wondering where everyone else's is. So I guess what I'm trying to say is dig deeper and find a way to invest in some of these communities. And I don't just mean buying a building here and there, but recruiting, trying to get young people on a path toward your company if you want, showing these communities that the welfare of their lives is just as urgent as your bottom line, and especially if you profit or have customers from some of these communities. It's the biggest thing you can do to stop this cycle that we've been seeing and to capitalize on the momentum. And business-wise, look at the environment we're in. There's never been a better and more accepted time to dig deep and find recruiting initiatives in the black community. Now, it's probably good PR for half of you. It's part of why I took a little offense to what the Wells Fargo CEO said when he blamed his lack of diversity at his company on a shortage of black talent. Because that's the wrong way to look at things. He's complaining about a lack of apples when he's standing in the section for oranges. This is where companies like yours come in. I challenge you to start looking in places you hadn't before. I mentioned in the beginning my job doesn't so much happen in one place. It happens really everywhere. And everywhere I've been this year on this type of story, the message is the same. People want opportunities. This year was about an opportunity to be heard over injustices they've seen, but ones they've wanted you to see too. Now it's about growth. You have the information, maybe even overloaded with it. But what are you going to do with it? How will you dig deep? And I thought hard about what my message would be to you all, to this room, this powerful room, because you're all smart people. But this is something that's stuck with me for a long time. I'm a 6'1", 205-pound basketball-playing black man. I just happened to grow up in the suburbs of Atlanta, where I could pick up some of the subtle mannerisms and mindsets that, unbeknownst to me, would help me out later on. I've never been able to help myself from thinking that if my sane body and mind had been born in West Baltimore, I could have been Freddie Gray. I was a product of circumstance. It's a circumstance you have the power to create, and if there was ever a time to embrace that urgency, it's now. Thank you so much for having me, everyone. I wish I could be there in person. Next time I'm there, though, we are cracking a natty bow, and we're getting into some crab. Thank you again.
Thank you, Omar, for those very special words and the call to action that you conveyed to our annual meeting attendees. It is great to have you reporting to us again in Baltimore.